Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this Stop the War Coalition session this evening on the US elections, peace prospects, prospects for war and peace. We have 4 speakers that I'm sure many of you will know and you'll hear from in the course of this evening. I trust wherever you are in the world, you're joining us to not only listen to partake as well, because after we've heard all 4 of our speakers, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our first speaker, who's the co-founder of the peace group CODEPINK, and also the co-founder of Global Exchange. She's an author, peace activist, and I understand a wannabe salsa dancer as well from her Twitter handle. Medea Benjamin.
Hi, lovely to be on with you. I always enjoy doing things with the Stop the War Coalition and talking about what are the prospects for peace post-election. First, let me do a very quick review of what we've had with Trump for the last 4 years, because it's so interesting that he likes to tout himself as an anti-war president. He talks about how he has is one of the only presidents that hasn't started a new war, and how he's bringing the troops home, and he gets a lot of support from the base when he talks as an anti-war president. And yet if you look at the record, well, he did have 4 years to bring the troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan. He started to bring some, but it's at the end of his term, and who knows what it'll look like when, if indeed he gets defeated now, but he hasn't brought all the troops home. And he continues to have US troops in Syria, where he said he was pulling them out. US continues to be engaged in Somalia. And I think one of the worst things that he's done is the embrace of the Saudis and their war in Yemen. It was quite remarkable how we in the anti-war movement managed to form a very broad-based coalition that passed 5 bills. And passing bills in the US Congress is very difficult because you have a Republican-controlled Senate. We managed to get enough Republicans to pass 5 bills to stop the US support for the Saudi war in Yemen, and Trump vetoed every single one of those bills. The viewers probably know how close he has embraced the Israelis, even more so than a number of past presidents, and how he is touting that one of his great accomplishments has been these new, quote, peace deals with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, making these deals with Israel brokered by the Trump administration. But let's not be fooled, these are not really peace deals. They're more like weapons deals, because they come with a call for the US to provide more weapons to both the UAE and Bahrain. And it's also part of a coalition, strengthened coalition against Iran. Iran is where I feel that President Trump has done the most harm internationally, in pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, in antagonizing Iran, having that spill over to Iraq and the whole region. Even though he tried to make a peace overture to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, he never followed through on that with any carrots for the North Koreans to continue that process along. His sanctions against countries like Iran and Venezuela and Cuba have been just brutal. And many more countries have been sanctioned economically, which is a form of warfare. And he has really antagonized China and pushed that conflict with the new Cold War with China. So I wouldn't say by any means that he is, quote, a peace president. When it comes to Biden, we would have a more, quote, normal imperial president that would be close to the policies of Obama, which were actually close to the policies of Bush, which are actually not that far from the policies of Trump. He would perhaps mend some of the relations with the international organizations, like going back into the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accords, some of these nuclear deals with Russia. But he would continue to increase the Pentagon budget to keep troops in the Middle East, to keep the US the #1 arms merchant in the world, continue the modernization of US nuclear weapons, continue the very close relationship with Israel. The positive thing about a Biden administration would be that he promises to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, which is extremely important and could have a positive spillover effect throughout the region. He has called Saudi Arabia a pariah state. I don't think that he would do anything very dramatic when it comes to stopping US close ties with Saudi Arabia, but I don't think they would be as close as they have been under the Trump administration. And perhaps we could get bills passed, and I don't think he would veto them if they got to his desk, about stopping US support for the war in Yemen. So that would be very good. He would continue the close ties with Israel. He calls himself the greatest friend of Israel. When it comes to Latin America, I think he would perhaps reestablish relations with Cuba, as the Obama administration did. He would take military option off the table when it comes to Venezuela, but would still be pushing for a regime change in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. So the best thing we can say about a Biden win would be that he would be more amenable to a push from the grassroots for changes in U.S. policy. We have had, as a coalition of peace groups, a very hard time influence anything in this Trump administration. But we've already been having talks with Biden's people, not that they might mean anything, but at least we have access already. And there is a sense that well, Obama, when he came in, he destroyed a lot of grassroots movements, particularly the peace movement, because people didn't want to protest a Democratic president, the first Black president, a president who said that he was going to get us out of some of the wars. I don't think people have that same attitude towards Biden. The grassroots movement does not particularly like Biden, feel that we have to put the pressure on him starting from now. And so I think that we would be able to build a stronger anti-war coalition under Biden. I think we have done in the last 4 years, a positive job of linking the anti-war movements with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the gun control movement in the United States, with the climate crisis, with issues like the Poor People's Campaign that's calling for a moral budget. So we're in a better position than we have been in the last 4 years to really close the circle, to show how much there is a strong anti-war sentiment in the United States, which crosses party lines, includes anti-imperial Republicans, includes libertarians, and certainly when it comes to the more progressive sectors of our economy, there is a sentiment that it's time, and we've seen these in the polls, time to bring the troops back. It's time to cut the Pentagon budget. We've had our first forays into Congress of bills calling for cuts in the Pentagon budget, a more modest one of 10%. They got a pretty good response. And a more dramatic one of cutting it in half, which got almost no response. But we are in a good position to push that as we move forward. So I actually hope that we do get a chance to have a Biden presidency so that we can build up this movement, put more pressure on, form stronger ties with our friends overseas, our allies like you in the UK, so that we can also focus on the issue of NATO and how do we disentangle ourselves from that obsolete military alliance, and move the United States in the direction of a post-imperial power, given that the world sees with COVID how we can't even keep ourselves healthy, much less be leaders in the world. And with the economic recession that is befalling the entire world, the US will not be in a position to lead that either. So maybe we can move to the post-imperial world towards a world of many powers and a more peaceful world. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Medina, for giving us that overview and illustrating very well, whilst President Trump would like to appear as anti-war, in reality he's been quite different record, quite honestly, and he's not yet achieved bringing any troops back of any sort, although let's see what happens in Afghanistan. And on this basis, can I make our first announcement tonight? One of the things that Stop the War Coalition will be joining at the beginning of the year is the International Day of Action for Yemen against the Saudi Arabian military action against Yemen, along with all those involved in it, on the 25th of January 2021. I hope, let's not forget what's happening to the Yemenis, not only with the military action, but under the pandemic, which equally puts more pressure on the people and inhabitants of Yemen today and in the immediate future. Can I now go to our next speaker, who's also from the States. He's a historian at the City University of New York and the editor of New Left Review, Alexander Zevin. Alexander, the floor's yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to follow Medea. And I salute the work that she does with CODEPINK and particularly the progress that they've made on the war in Yemen, at least in terms of passing resolutions and so forth. So what I wanted to talk about is related to what Medea talked about, which is the relationship between the left and a possible Biden administration, an administration that's looking more and more likely every day, and sort of what it should be, what it should expect from the Biden administration. Back in 2008, when Obama chose Biden to be his running mate, in part to shore up his position with the Israel lobby, the great late journalist Alexander Coburn had this to say about Joe Biden. He is a man so rightly symbolic of everything that is unchanging and hopeless about our political system that a computer simulation of the corporate political paradigm senator in Congress would turn out Biden in a nanosecond. Now, Biden, of course, like much software that's produced these days, does have some glitches. That being said, the thing that is most important, I think, about Biden, and the thing that I think the left in the US needs to keep in mind is the way that he embodies this idea of consensus and bipartisanship. And that this is the real threat that I think an administration led by Biden poses, and it's what we need to be paying attention to. Now, when Biden won the nomination, when he sealed the primary against Sanders, which was not the outcome that I and many other progressives hoped for, in March, I think there was a tendency to look for silver linings in that defeat. And so there were a series of headlines and articles that were published around that time, and I continue to hear echoes of it today, that made the argument that a Biden administration would be the most radical since FDR. A New York Magazine article at the time showed Biden from his porch and said that he plots a presidency that by awful necessity he believes must be more ambitious than FDR's. And in a variant of this, there were also arguments that he would be forced to be the next Lyndon B. Johnson, and that the pandemic and the combination of the pandemic and mass unemployment would lead him to make more radical proposals when it comes to civil rights and to social welfare programs. Now, I think that is basically, there are 2 points I want to make about this. The first is that this is an example of magical thinking, in my view, because Biden has, since the late 1970s, dedicated his career to undermining those programs. He was a sort of third way Democrat before there was a third way, passing and sponsoring legislation to cut back on welfare rolls, to cap entitlement spending. His work culminated in the 1996 welfare reform bill, along with the famous crime bill. And these are the programs that people now depend on amidst the mass unemployment of the pandemic. Already in the 1970s, he was endorsing the Southern strategy, whereby Democrats would win if they pursued sort of the middle class, affluent voters in the suburbs. Now, that's 1 point about Biden and who he is. But I think the other thing about these comparisons, these hopeful ideas that Biden will be a more radical president than anyone ever expected, and those comparisons to LBJ and to FDR, or what they leave out. And that, of course, is the foreign policy dimension, that under these rather limited, in the case of the US, expansions of the US welfare state, we also saw the beginnings of the vast secret state that now spans over 17 different agencies in the United States and with over $60 billion budget every year, as well as wars abroad, from the Second World War through to Vietnam. And in terms of domestic surveillance, the loyalty oaths that were instituted under Truman, all the way to COINTELPRO under Johnson and Nixon. So these are not sort of necessarily, this consensus is not necessarily something that the left should be sanguine about. And I think that I'm not saying that I don't think Biden would in many ways be better than Trump, but I am saying that the left, especially the left that's gathered here in the Stop the War coalition and in the US too, needs to be extremely wary of what it would mean to treat domestic achievements in social reform separately from the kinds of foreign policy issues that have often been separated in the case of the US at the expense of one another. We have to think about those things together, the way that they're related in a coherent analysis. The second point is just to talk a little bit, Medea already did this to a certain extent, about the actual record and what that record is likely to produce in terms of foreign policy when it comes to a Biden presidency. And I think that this is really important, again, thinking back to that Coburn quote about the paradigm senator, what Biden represents, because it's really in this realm, the realm of foreign policy, that bipartisanship, especially since the end of the Cold War, has been so pernicious. The idea that Republicans and Democrats can come together to agree on what it means for America to lead the world. And a Biden presidency, now this is the actual slogan of the Biden campaign, is that it would restore America's leadership to the world. Now, we have to ask on the left what that leadership has ever meant, and why it would not be a good thing for that leadership to be restored in the kind of way that the Biden campaign has in mind. Now, what has that consensus looked like since the end of the Cold War when it comes to Biden? Well, Biden pushed for NATO expansion to the borders of Russia in the 1990s and 2000s. He backed Clinton's air war on Kosovo while urging that ground troops be sent there, as well as to the Sudan. As chair of the Foreign Relations Committee from 2001 to 2003, he not only voted to authorize the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but as leader of that committee, helped to whitewash the hearings that led up to it in coordination with Bush. Under Obama, as Obama's vice president, he was put in charge of Iraq. Joe will do Iraq, that is what Obama said, with disastrous outcomes. Endorsing Maliki and supporting him, sectarian, corrupt, led to the rise of Islamic State, or allowed Iraq to be overrun. Ukraine, he was the point person on Ukraine, pushed for IMF loans that were quickly stolen, as well as his son Hunter serving on the board of Burisma, the natural gas company there, and being paid $850,000 for doing we don't know what. He was also the point person in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where the democratically elected president Manuel Zelaya was overthrown with the backing of the Obama administration, and thus bears responsibility for the regime of Juan Orlando Hernandez, which to this day is disappearing and killing indigenous activists, most notably Berta Cáceres, as well as illegally prolonging his own powers, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the record. Now, Medea already referred to his positions on Venezuela and how that would continue. He was campaigning the other day in Florida about his position on Cuba, and although he favors a return to the policies of engagement under Obama, he was clear about what that policy of engagement means. Recognition, he said, yes, recognition, quote, but there is no reason why we cannot still sanction them, right? And the point of recognition, he put it in the debates in March. The one debate we got with Sanders was Obama was trying to change Cuba policy so the Cuban people would get out from under the thumb of Castro and his brother. His campaign has made it clear that they will not move the embassy that was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem back, and that under no circumstances will aid to Israel be conditioned based on Israeli behavior when it comes to the and settlements. So in all of these ways and more, when it comes to Russia, NATO, North Korea, and I would argue even Iran, even a return to the nuclear deal, we're talking about a return to the status quo ante that is itself deeply destabilizing, risks war, risks further embargoes, sanctions, and needs to be opposed by by the left. And that's leaving out the question of China and the way that the plight of Uyghurs or the fate of democracy in Hong Kong is going to be instrumentalized by the Biden administration, assuming there is one, for a new Cold War with China for its own strategic aims in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, or when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. So I could go on with particular examples, but I guess I just want to conclude my remarks by saying that it seems to me that the period of Trump's being in power has, perversely or not, opened a window for the left. Trump's slagging off of allies in NATO, his continual attacks on the FBI and the CIA, his in some ways kind of parodic but continuous but parodic levels of support for the Saudi regime after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, his dismemberment at the hands of the regime of Salman, Prince Salman. All of these things and more besides, I think, are much lamented by the better sort of commentator at the New York Times and the Washington Post. But from the perspective of the left, this is a window for us to critique and to call into question long-standing elements of the bipartisan consensus when it comes to foreign policy. And we should keep that window open with a crowbar, if necessary, when Biden comes into office. Medea already talked about some of the ways that she's trying to do that. And I think it's vital to understand that this is not going to be necessarily a pretty or an easy battle, but it is one that the left really must make it a focus to try and keep open. And that means, I think, and just as a final remark, whatever else it means in terms of civil society and strikes and protests and occupations, it means that Congress and the progressive members of Congress need to try and reduce the powers of the imperial presidency, whether that is through the invocation of the War Powers Act or through its control of the public purse in terms of financing. Defunding the police should also become a slogan for defunding the Pentagon and the secret state. All of these things need to be on the table from the very moment that a Biden administration comes about, should that happen. So I'll stop there. Hopefully we can talk about all this stuff, but that's it for me for now.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your thoughts on the left's relationship with a potential Biden administration and how they see themselves as restoring US leadership to the world. His checkered record, actually, on foreign affairs and the issues that need to be demanded by the left almost straight away, like defunding the industrial military complex, clearly is one of those that will be demanded. Now, whilst Alex was speaking, we've been joined by colleagues on Facebook as well, and people from Fort Williams and Ontario. I think Fort Williams is probably, I don't know if that's Scotland or in the States, but it's one or the other. We've also, if you're keen to join Stop the War or Code Pink, if you look at the chat lines, links have been sent to you to do just that as we go through the rest of this session this evening, and you may want to do it afterwards as well. So do look out for those messages on the chat lines for those who may want to join us in our calls. Our next speaker, those of you involved with Stop the War will be all too familiar with, the convener of Stop the War Coalition and essentially the lifebeats of the operations here in the UK, Lindsey German. Lindsey, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Murad. I'd just like to say, first of all, how very good it is to have Medea and Alex here tonight and giving us their knowledge and expertise on this. It's we get so little really in this country of serious analysis about what's happening, and particularly in relation to questions of foreign policy. I mean, and I suppose we should just perhaps, before I say anything about this, perhaps just to say how good the election result in Bolivia was yesterday, and that tells you. I know all of us, and we've all been campaigning for many years over a whole range of issues, and we're kind of used to lost causes, and we got a very good campaign, but we didn't stop the war or whatever it was. And it is very gratifying to know that actually there are many people who resist this, and we know this is happening in many parts of the world, particularly in Latin America, where the whole policy of the US, as everybody knows, has been these major interventions, both directly and indirectly into the democratic process in Latin America. So I think that's something to really be heartened about. But in general, I think the picture that Medea and Alex painted is of course not a heartening picture in terms of US imperialism, because what you're actually, and this relates to British imperialism, because as we know, whatever the US does is likely to be followed very, very closely by successive British governments. There's a kind of bipartisan approach to this question. And we should also remember, I know you had in the States the whole debate over Bernie Sanders and what kind of candidate should represent the Democratic Party. But as we know, those of us who supported Jeremy Corbyn, and we've lived through nearly 5 years of his leadership until he was defeated in the election last year, we know how important these foreign policy questions are, and how important it is to the ruling class in this country. And I include in that sections of people around the Labour Party, some of the right wing of the PLP, these sorts of people, how important it is to maintain this bipartisan approach to foreign policy. And it seems to me that the left, the point that Alex made, if the left is going to be worth anything, we cannot divorce domestic and foreign policy issues. In fact, my argument is always that actually foreign policy is domestic policy. It is about where you spend your money. It is about where you throw your weight around in the world. It's about all those different sorts of things. So I think this is a very important discussion for us. The previous speakers have outlined what similarities and what differences there's going to be if Biden wins, and people seem fairly certain now that he will be the next president, that you will see some change in the attitude towards Iran and the nuclear deal, but as I understand it, with more restrictions than the original nuclear deal. So in other words, accepting really that Iran is the problem that has to be contained and that it has to be treated in this kind of way. We know that essentially, while some of the more extreme Trump love-ins with Netanyahu and the support for the completely illegal annexation of the West Bank and some of those policies may be slightly lessened by Biden, we know that essentially his approach to Israel is going to be the same as every other American administration. We know that in Afghanistan, although they're desperately talking about a peace deal, and they really do want a peace deal, I think now, but of course peace on the US terms, we know there are still, 8,500 US troops in there, 4 years after Trump, I think, amassed quite a lot of support by saying that he would end the wars and he would bring the troops home. In fact, I was very interested, Medea didn't mention it tonight, but she wrote an article the other week where you mentioned this report, Medea, where you said in Wisconsin, I think Pennsylvania and Michigan, that some of the counties which had very high casualties from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been ones which had voted for Trump in higher numbers than they had elsewhere. And I think that definitely hit home, as people have made the point. Trump hasn't done any of these things. He hasn't ended the wars. He hasn't started a new war, but he didn't really need to when you think of all the sanctions, when you think of the green light that he's given to Israel, when you think of all those other kind of things. So I think we're talking about a situation where very much things will continue. NATO is absolutely central to both the British and the American ruling classes. And of course, the new Cold War with China, which Trump has been much more upfront about in the last year or so than before, and the great economic rivalry that there is between the US and China. This is something where essentially there is a bipartisan policy. There's not going to be a fundamental break with all those things. So I think all of these things are very, very important for us. I'd like to add a couple of other elements to it, if I may, as part of the discussion generally about war and peace and so on. The first is the question of Islamophobia, which existed long before Trump became president, existed before the war on terror, although the war on terror gave it kind of rocket boosters in terms of it becoming the major racist state ideology in the developed world, in Britain and France and the US and so on. And there is no question that Trump has provided a megaphone for the worst aspects of Islamophobia, with his followers, with the way that he tweets, with his policy on excluding people from mainly Muslim countries, all that sort of thing. And I think that I'm sure that there are many people in the US. I know there are many people who do campaign around this issue, but it seems to me this is an issue we still have to confront, and we still have to reject the whole idea that Muslim equals extremist equals terrorist, which is the common narrative now in culture, in everyday life. And that's something that I think Trump has definitely worsened. The second is the COVID crisis, which, you know, again, Britain and the US are some of the worst of the rich countries in their response and in the level of infections and so on. And I think we have to look at the question of why it is that so much money is spent on the military, on arms, how militarized these countries are. I mean, the US, it always strikes me, is an incredibly militarized country. I'm not saying Britain isn't. Britain obviously is as well, but it's quite remarkable, all the connections between the military and so on. And then finally, of course, there's the question of racism and the great Black Lives Matter protests and all the protests that are still going on, which clearly Trump is using the backlash against those as a weapon in the elections, hopefully not too successfully. But that question of racism as well is part of the imperialism, it's part of these wars, it's part of the drive to war, it's part of all those sorts of things. So I think when we look at what is happening in the US and what will happen if Biden becomes president, then I think we have to think very much about how the left responds, not just at the level of what we say about politics, mainstream politics and so on, but how we organise and how we campaign around these issues, and for a very, very vocal campaign over racism and Islamophobia, but also, and in this country as well, where we have exactly the same, maybe not always in the same dimensions, but we have exactly the same problems. But also, we cannot continue where people do not have decent healthcare, do not have decent education, do not have housing, do not have all these things, and therefore very often use Black people or migrants or whatever as scapegoats, and thinking that they're to blame for these kind of situations. We cannot continue with a world where we have these priorities, where we have this inequality and we have this militarism and war. So just again, to just thank very, very much the speakers, and I'm sure Tariq as well, just to thank you in advance, Tariq. But, you know, I think this is a fantastically important discussion for us to have, and how we can work together in the future.
Okay, well, thank you, Lindsey, for that contribution, and not forgetting some of the Islamophobia. But let's not forget Trump's xenophobia, anti-Chinese sentiments. He's had it right from his campaigning as president all the way through his administration, and unfortunately, I think that's going to be one of his lasting legacy in the global context, as well as domestically in America, when they've had issues with their racism against the Chinese for some time. Now that said, I'm just picking up some of the messages. Brian Murphy has corrected me and told me it's Fort William, Scotland, and not the United States. So I'm glad he's confirmed that. I just hope Mr. Trump doesn't end up in Scotland. He has said recently that if he loses the election, he'll leave the country. I certainly hope he doesn't step foot in the UK, if only because of his golf courses here. And we're getting questions coming in, so do feed through the questions as well, because we'll have time to ask a few to our speakers. Our last speaker needs really no introduction, so I'll make his introduction brief. He's a writer, filmmaker, and editor of the New Left Review. He has written many books on history and politics, plus 7 novels. Tariq Ali, the floor is yours.
Hi. Well, it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with so many good people. And I was surprised. I wasn't aware till Medea informed us that so many bills had managed to get through the House and had landed on Trump's desk, which is positive. And that is something, because of the different political systems, we can't quite repeat in this country. But that will be very useful. Whether he signs them or not is another question, to keep up the pressure on the Biden presidency when he comes into office. Now, look, I just want to make 3 or 4 basic points. One is the following, that the decision made by the imperial leadership of the United States, whether under the Republicans, i.e. the Bushes, or the Democrats, Obama, Clinton, was after 9/11 basically to go and remake the Middle East. That's the word they use. So, they would sometimes say to bring democracy there, etc., etc. Well, according to their own aims, they failed miserably. They've not been able to remake the Middle East. What they have been able to do is what I think was the plan in any case, to end a situation where there is a single country in that region which is sovereign. They destroyed Iraq, which had a large army and was a sovereign state. They attempted to do that in Syria. They didn't quite succeed. And Syria is in a mess. How sovereign it is open to debate, given the interventions that this provoked from the Russians and the Iranians. So the Middle East is in a terrible mess, and the entire forward march of Arab nationalism under leaders of one sort or another has been halted. And that is a triumph for the United States. There's no two ways around it. They haven't been able to achieve what they claimed they wanted to achieve, but they've succeeded in dividing the Middle East up once again, as Britain did after the First World War. And that is encouraging tiny little statelets. And the one country that was sovereign and hadn't been broken was, of course, the Yemen. And they've now divided it. That where the war is still going on and is extremely vicious is northern Yemen, where the Saudis are directly involved. And I think it's very unlikely that they're going to succeed. And southern Yemen has more or less been handed over to the Gulf states, who are actually pouring in money as well. So if you speak to people from South Yemen, they'll say, for us, it's not as bad as it is for the Yemenis in the north, but what it's done is to divide Yemen. And we'll see how this war pans out. It's one of the more vicious, one of the least reported wars that the United States waged through its principal relay, or its second most important relay in the region, which is Saudi Arabia. The most important relay of the United States since the '67 war, of course, has been Israel. And here they have now completely, I don't think Biden has any intention of reversing this, by the way, saying that Jerusalem is the official capital, which was opposed in a token way by the European countries, including Britain, and by saying that effectively supporting the total annexation of the Palestinian lands, where the PLO still has some authority. Only yesterday or 2 days ago, they decided to build more settlements to divide each Palestinian city from the other. All the major European countries have opposed this and critiqued it. The United States, of course, gave the green light under Trump for this to happen. So an important part of the world is in a huge mess. Iran, they're trying to crush via killer sanctions, which, as we know, these sanctions very rarely affect those who rule a country, whether it's Cuba or Iran or Venezuela, but they affect the lives of ordinary people. And that is exactly what is happening in Iran. And of course, it's done deliberately because they hope by these sanctions, which are used more and more now by the imperial power, that they will encourage the population to revolt against its leadership. This happens very rarely. It didn't happen with the long years of sanctions they imposed on Iraq. It's not happened in Cuba. It's not happened in Venezuela, where they even had a puppet president, still recognized, by the way, by all the NATO states, or most of them, as the official president of Venezuela, who has no standing and has now been denounced by the rest of the opposition as well. So these sanctions, the aim of these sanctions is to try and encourage dissent in these countries and fund uprisings, but they very rarely worked as such. And the key demand on Biden is not so much to resume the nuclear discussions, which the Iranians never withdrew from themselves, but actually to end the sanctions against Iran. That is the single most important demand, to let that country breathe a bit. And as for the corruptions supported by the Saudis and the French in particular in Lebanon, these exploded literally not so long ago, reducing Beirut to a slum in large parts of that old and very beautiful city. And the people in power are still in power. None of the politicians who did nothing, knowing that this arms dump existed, have done anything since then. So that is the situation in the Middle East, one of the key areas of conflict. People have already spoken about Afghanistan, which is now the longest war that the United States has waged against any country in its entire history, the war in Afghanistan. Let's not forget it started off in 2011 and it's still going on. You know, it's now a sort of limited insurgency war because they're negotiating and trying to see what they can get and whether the Pakistani regime and military will actually greenlight a deal with some sections of the Taliban. That is what is going on there. But I think there is a debate, and this is a crucial debate in Afghanistan, on and a difference within the Taliban is whether to permit any US military bases in the country at all. The more conciliatory wing of the Taliban, backed by the Pakistani army, is saying it doesn't matter if one or two bases are left. The others are saying no. And the pressure from China on both Pakistan and Afghanistan is to say that, look, it's a joke, because this is not any old country. We have a border with Afghanistan. And a military base right on our borders is a huge provocation to us, regardless of what you might think about it or not. So Latin America has already been mentioned, constantly under attack, constantly under fire. The Bolivians have fought back. The Venezuelan government, they haven't been able to remove it or defeat it because the Venezuelan military refuses to play ball with the United States. They thought that's how they'd get it and give the country a new president, courtesy Washington, D.C. But that hasn't happened because the army is not playing with them. Cuba remains quite solid at the moment and has got a non-Castro leadership in the sense that one brother is dead and the other is no longer in charge on a daily basis. And the Argentinians re-elected a Peronist government, etc., etc. So it's not a continent under control. Likewise, Africa, where the Chinese intervention in terms of trade, building infrastructures has annoyed the United States, but they haven't been able to do too much about it because that is not what they offer. normally when they trade with a country. They very rarely, if ever, build its infrastructure. And the country where an infrastructure is badly needed and needs to be rebuilt is, of course, the United States itself. I mean, many of its cities are in a terrible state on the level of infrastructure, as we know. And Lindsey was quite right to mention that cutting the military budgets would have a big impact, actually, on releasing money for things which we can all agree on, actually, on all sides, improving conditions of life for ordinary people who live in these countries. The last point I want to make is on China. Now, how is it that China, which was a favorite of the United States for a long, long time, they used it to defeat the Russians, they used it to give them help during the Afghan war against the Russians. I mean, the Chinese government now talks about terrorists in Xinjiang, but these terrorists were born when the Chinese decided to allow groups in Xinjiang to recruit for sending into Afghanistan, when the Russians had to be defeated. That is what brought, and when they came back, they carried on organizing. Exactly the same thing happened in Egypt, in Pakistan, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and all the other, Algeria, where they had jihadis going in to fight. So why not Xinjiang? It's not their fault that they were so selected to do so. But forget all that for a minute. What is the principal reason for the American assault on China? It is, of course, partially trade, but even that could have been managed. The basic reason, I think, is that the Chinese have now done something they hadn't done for a long time as they were building up their economy, which is they've begun to disagree with the United States on world politics, both in the Far East and the world. And they have voted against the United States at the United Nations a number of times, which has made it difficult to use the Security Council as an instrument of war. And this display of Chinese sovereignty and Chinese independence is what has actually led to considerable acrimony behind the scenes. This, coupled with the continual growth of the Chinese economy and the fact that the Chinese are the principal economic rivals of the United States, these two things have combined now to make China a target for US anger, for suggestions that they have to be defeated. It's a similar process with the Russians. When Yeltsin was in power, all was fine. He could go and bomb Chechnya, he could kill people. Fine, said Bush and Blair. Not a problem for us, he's an ally. The minute you have Putin doing something which they don't like, either in the Ukraine or the Crimea, i.e. behaving like the United States does in different parts of the world, that upsets them. But how can a state assert its sovereignty in such a fashion? The reason it can is because here too, they're saying if the Americans can do it, why can't we do it? And now, will Biden be any different? I think in style, yes. In substance, very little, especially in terms of foreign policy. The woman who is being touted to be his new defense secretary, Michelle Flournoy, who's worked for a number of administrations in the defense, in the Office of Defense in the United States, working under different secretaries of defense, she's quite hardline. And if you read her last article, How to Prevent a War in Asia, the erosion of American deterrence raises the risk of Chinese miscalculation, she's basically saying, actually she's put it down, that we need ramped up US military activity in the region, the dispatch of more troops and carriers, which could, to shore up Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. We should step up roving war games in Asia to show the Chinese that the US has modern technology, might, and will to deter Chinese aggression, and that without such ramped up US military activity, and without the technology to ward off a Chinese cyber attack on US navigation systems, Flournoy says we might stumble into a nuclear confrontation with China over Taiwan. This is actually basically fear-mongering and scaremongering. The Chinese defense capacity, military capacity, remains largely defensive. It is not doing what the Russians did before Gorbachev, which is to compete with the United States, which basically led to the implosion there. The Chinese are being very careful in how much they spend on military spending. But at the same time, knowing that there are US troops present in Japan and in Korea, they are not prepared to just laugh this off and say it doesn't matter. They say it does matter. The fact that these countries still are occupied, and who speaks for them. And we know who speaks for them in foreign policy terms. Mostly, it's Washington. So the ramping up of the attack on China, I think, is serious. We have to look at it, and without becoming apologists for what the Chinese are doing, either in Hong Kong or Xinjiang or anywhere else, we have to put this clash into perspective, that essentially it is a decision by the United States to seek a confrontation, economic and partially military, it would appear, with the Chinese. And this is a very dangerous business, because the Chinese are far more effective economically, politically, and militarily than the Russians ever were, if the truth be told. So it'll backfire badly if this happens. But a Biden victory will not affect this very much. They'll be clever in the way they do it. There'll be more multilateral exchanges. And usually what these multilateral exchanges mean is that they get Europe to do their bidding in a nicer way. They put on a mask again, but they make sure that Europe does their bidding. And whether Europe will carry on doing this is another question, because there's crises opening up in various European countries as well. So it's going to be a tricky 5 years, whoever wins. And obviously, from the point of view of the left, a defeat for Trump would open up much more space, as has been pointed out, for activity. Because once you have a Democratic president in office, it becomes extremely difficult to look towards any other political party within the bourgeois political system. You have to combat and fight. Difficult with Obama, as it was, we know, but much, much easier with Biden. So we shouldn't have any illusions. We should be preparing to struggle, as I'm sure many people are.
Thank you very much, Tariq, for giving us the historical perspective and all this, as well as covering the China aspects of foreign policy as we're seeing from the States. Now, before I open up, I've already got a few questions which I'll ask our panelists. Just an announcement I need to make about an online rally we're having this Thursday for our British, those Brits watching us, this rally is against the Spy Cops Bill here in the UK, which is going through Parliament at the moment. I think it's going to the Lords by the end of the week. Please join us at 7 o'clock on Thursday on the Stop the War website for that rally. It's an important thing which we shouldn't lose sight of, and could potentially constrain what we can do as a campaigning organisation, campaigning anti-war organisation. Now, coming to the questions, the first one that I'm going to bring up is one which has been asked by several people, from David Gassan and others. How much influence could Kamala Harris have over Biden's administration's foreign policy? Can I ask our colleagues from the States, Alex and Medea, to answer that? You probably know her better than we do. Medea?
Sure. She has not made foreign policy an important part of her agenda, even when she was running for president herself. But she certainly does have a record as senator. She's been very close to the Israel lobby, AIPAC, when our grassroots organizations put pressure on all the presidential candidates to not go to the AIPAC convention. She did listen and didn't go to the convention, but then the next day hosted an AIPAC delegation in her office. She is opposed to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but she didn't go as far as voting for it to be declared illegal. When Trump has made overtures to North Korea or Russia, she has come back very hard saying, why would you deal with those dictators? And when it comes to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, while she did eventually co-sponsor some of the good legislation around stopping US support for the war in Yemen, she has called Saudi Arabia an important ally of the United States. And then lastly, I talk about her and the Pentagon budget. She votes for the Pentagon budget, and when there was this piece of legislation that I mentioned that was to cut the Pentagon budget by, I would say, a mere 10%, she voted against that, which was seen as part of positioning herself to be a viable candidate as for vice president in the Biden administration. So in sum, she would not be very helpful.
Okay, thank you, Medea. Alex, have you got anything to add to that?
Medea put it really, really well. That was a really excellent, concise explanation of Kamala Harris's potential role and of what she's stood for. I think one of the things to say about Kamala Harris is that she was a very attractive candidate on paper in the primaries, and the New York Times in particular was an early champion of her candidacy. But in fact, she won no votes and inspired very little enthusiasm. And I think that's in part because the triangulating around issues like the issue of AIPAC is a perfect example of the way that she would during the campaign take one position to please progressives, and then the very next day take a secret meeting that undermined that entire gesture. And the same was true for her position on universal health care. And other things like that. I would just say that, Trump was criticized for using Dennis Rodman as a go-between to North Korea, but I'd rather Dennis Rodman advise an administration than a lot of the old China hands and others who are likely to make a comeback, who are rubbing their hands together to make their way back to the State Department as we speak.
Well, thank you, Alex. The next, there's also a set of questions around Palestine. They come from Azad and Pia, and I'll aim at Lindsey, if you can be ready for this. Does it make a difference to the Palestinian cause who wins, Trump or Biden? Lindsey?
Well, I guess most people will be pleased to see the back of Trump, and obviously Trump has very much gone out of his way to look and to behave in the most sort of partisan way. But if you actually look at the policies that the US is following, you can't really say it will make much difference to the Palestinians. And in particular, what's happening to the Palestinians is the illegal settlements are now making it more and more impossible for the Palestinians to live in any kind of decent way. If you look at what's happening in Gaza, you're talking about, continued repression of the people of Gaza and the terrible situation that's still going on there. So I don't think fundamentally things will change. And I think it's important for us to understand this about the US's backing for Israel, which has always been very, very firm and very unconditional, really. And of course, there are differences in tactics, but the fact that he's saying that he won't move the embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem, I think does speak volumes as to exactly what Biden would be like. And I don't think that I don't think the Palestinians have got any interest in feeling that they're going to get a decent deal from Joe Biden, because they won't. And as has always been the case, they have to rely on their own struggles and the struggles of people in other countries and people like ourselves who can support BDS and those sorts of questions.
Okay, thank you, Lindsey. We've got a question from Catherine Hamilton. I think this is best for Tariq to respond to. Are dying empires ever more dangerous?
More dangerous than living empires? Well, at the moment, we've only got one empire, the United States of America. And alas, it's very much alive as an empire. And I'm not a great believer in all the wishful thinking and talking that sometimes goes on that suggests that the United States is on its last legs. I mean, if I was convinced about that, we could just relax and stop waging any struggles at all, because it's going to collapse. So I don't accept that. I think empires never go down just like that. They always fight. The situation after the Second World War was that the United States didn't allow the British and French empires in particular to collapse. They backed them up. They took over from the French in Vietnam. They took over from the British in Saudi Arabia and large parts of the Middle East, and that was a deal done. A deal between Churchill and Roosevelt. Even during the Second World War, they knew the British Empire couldn't handle things because financially it was bankrupt. Without the American treasury, it couldn't have fought the Second World War. They went into huge debts, etc., etc. So that empire was on the way out, but it was a neat transition, not from our point of view, but from the point of view of imperialists in Britain and the United States, that this transition could take place. The French have still maintained an empire of sorts in Africa, which shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, it's there. It's not on the same scale as the United States. And that's about it, really. I mean, the United States, despite all these crises and presidents like Trump, is hegemonic. And the fact that they could find that the American empire could invent an apparition like Obama, which was its sort of cleverest decision, was followed rapidly by Trump, who's discredited the United States, but the empire is still there and it will not go down easily.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tariq. We've actually, would you believe it, come to the end of our time already. It just shows when you're having good discussions and inputs from those watching from afar, that time goes very, very quickly. And I'm sad to say we've come to our allotted time. Can I thank our panelists here, Medea, Alex from the other side of the pond, Lindsey and Tariq from this side of the pond, and we'll undoubtedly all be watching the American elections on the 3rd of November. I just hope it's all sealed and settled on the night, but I don't suspect it will be by everything I'm reading and the way Mr. Trump is sending his messages out. So thank you everyone for coming along to watch and listen to our speakers. If you want to join us, Stop the War Coalition and Code Pink, do check your chat lines. You'll see links which will let you do that, and you can get involved in the anti-war movements. We've actually been doing reasonably well during this pandemic, and the important thing is that our numbers increase and we make our contributions from all the platforms that we create for ourselves, because very often we won't get the platforms, and it's very important that we talk to each other and across the world, as we've done this evening on events like forthcoming events like the US elections. So thank you very much again to our speakers, and can I thank you all for calling in and making your contributions. Sorry I couldn't deal with all the questions, but there were wide themes which I touched on, and I think they've been answered by our panelists. So thank you very much again this evening, and no doubt we'll have a long night on the 3rd of November in 2 weeks' time, particularly our American colleagues. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you all. Good
Bye.
night.
Bye.